Good afternoon, everyone. Today's presentation is entitled Climate Change, a Threat to Biodiversity, given by Professor Ken Page of the University of Illinois. Before we start, we'd like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscooten, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward to the next 150 years. Today, let me tell you a little about Dr. Page before he starts to speak. He holds a BS and an MS degree in wildlife management and biology from Arkansas State University and a PhD in ecology, evolutionary biology from Northern Arizona University. Following his PhD, he conducted postdoctoral work at the University of Utah in molecular genetics. He joined the Institute for Environmental Studies campaign in 1988. As an aside, I was happy to meet with him then on the committee. He is currently a professor in the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Behavior at the U of I, where he served 12 years as head of the department. He works in the field of plant-animal interactions and conservation biology, using a combination of field studies and molecular genetic approaches. Today, the abstract of his work is that in this presentation, he will discuss the causes of anthropogenic climate change and biological response that has been widely documented across taxa and regions. Documented responses include population decay and local extirpation, geographic range shifts, altered phenologies, and biome regime shifts. He will also discuss whether species are maintaining a good match between phenotype and environment, i.e., whether observed trait changes are adaptive. He will also touch on the differences and consequent similarities between invasive and native species in light of climate change. Unlike the introduction of non-native species, which tends to be idiosyncratic and usually depends on human-mediated transport, climate-driven redistribution is ubiquitous, follows repeated patterns, and is poised to influence a greater proportion of Earth's biota. And before I give you over to him, let me remind you of a couple of housekeeping items. Please stay muted and ask your questions through chat, and we will address those at the end of the talk. The talk will be recorded, and you will be given the recording later. And Please, if you can remember, fill out the evaluation of Dr. Page's talk. And now, Dr. Page, thank you so much for coming to talk to us about this important issue.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's a real honor to be invited by you, first of all. You were one of my early mentors here at the U of I and touched my life in many ways that no one would appreciate but me. And thank you for your guidance. All right. What I wanted to do today is, first of all, start out with a slide. This is a simulation model that was put together by the Nature Conservancy back in 2019. And what they're showing here are migration patterns through time of amphibians in yellow, birds in purple, and in blue are mammals. And the point that I want to make with this is note that all of the migration patterns that have been simulated are moving northward, and that's due to changing temperatures. So this is based predominantly on temperature shifts through time. So I just thought the simulation was sort of neat and appropriate, and I'll remove it. All right. See if I can get it to change here. All right, so here's sort of the outline of the talk, paralleling what Elizabeth just shared with us. I'm going to talk about the causes and consequences of climate change, species responses to climate change, including geographic range shifts, altered phenologies, asynchronies, failures to adjust or adapt, and evolutionary change through genetic adaptation or phenotypic plasticity, and decreasing body size, which is not something that's typically talked about, but something that seems to be occurring. I'm going to then shift to ecosystem transformations. What are the differences and consequent similarities between invasive and native species in light of climate change? And then I'm going to end with a couple of slides about managing the effects of climate change. Okay. So the ultimate causes of climate change are human emissions of greenhouse gases. Not something you're probably surprised at. CO2 CO2 increases are caused by fossil fuel combustion and deforestation primarily, and it's the single largest contributor to global warming. It's primarily a problem of too much CO2 in the atmosphere. CO2 has the highest RF value. This is called the radiative forcing value. This is a difference between sunlight absorbed by the Earth and the energy radiated back to space. While other gases such as methane have more potent heat trapping ability molecule per molecule than CO2, these other gases are simply far less abundant in the atmosphere with much lower retention times, things such as methane. Now, what I want to show is the last 800,000 years of carbon dioxide in terms of parts per million in the atmosphere. And then if we take a look at the present time, we're actually up currently, as of March 2021, up to 417 parts per million. But the preceding 800,000 years prior were all much lower, with the highest previous concentration of about 300 parts per million. Now, if we look at the lower figure here, at the time of pre-industrial, we were at about 278 parts per million, leading to an approximate 50% increase at 417 parts per million. So we're seeing the rapid increase due to fossil fuel combustion, deforestation, predominantly. Now, combined surface air and sea surface temperatures averaged over the globe have increased by approximately 1 degree centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And reconstructions of historical temperature records suggest that the second half of the 20th century had higher average temperatures than any period in the last 1,500 years. And you can see here in the figure, both temperature and carbon dioxide are going basically hand in hand in terms of increasing carbon dioxide, leading to increases in global temperatures. Now, warming has been unequally distributed across the globe, with certain high latitude regions in the northern hemisphere and select equatorial regions warming considerably more than the global average, as high as 2.5 degrees centigrade, shown in the top figure here in purple. This is a 2.5 degree centigrade increase in the northern hemisphere, and also along the region of the equator. We're seeing, of course, spattered increases here and there. Rising temperatures have led to cascading effects on other components of Earth's climate, including global shifts in precipitation. This lower figure shows the observed change in annual precipitation over land since 1951. And you can see that we're getting increases in precipitation, shown in the blue, in millimeters per year per decade since the 1950s. So, and of course, we're experiencing increased weather patterns, destructive ones at that, here in the US, and of course globally as well. The Earth's cryosphere, or basically frozen water, has been altered with reduced ice caps, receding glaciers, and declining sea ice and snow. The Arctic sea ice has decreased by about 3.5 to 4% per decade to present, and global mean sea level has risen about 19 centimeters. So you can see that here, the sea ice extent in the figure on the top, on the right, from 1900 to 2012. The Arctic ice sheets have declined. The Antarctic ice sheets have remained relatively stable. The additional lines and colorings are just different data sets being strung together through time. Global mean sea level change from 1900 to 2010 is also increasing. As I noted, it's a rise of about 19 centimeters on average. But it's also unequally distributed because of the circulation of the ocean. For example, the sea levels are rising much greater on the western side of the Pacific Ocean, while on the eastern side of the Pacific Ocean, it's barely moved at all. So you can see there's a lot of variation across the climate, across the globe. Down here on the left, I have a figure of Antarctic sea ice at a summer's minimum in 2020. The yellow line around it is the median extent of the ice sheets during this same period in time. And so you can see that we've lost a great deal of the Arctic ice sheets during the summertime in particular. Okay, so the key point here is that climate change involves many different abiotic variables that are all changing simultaneously in terms of their averages, their ranges, variability, frequency, predictability, and seasonality. So here on the left, the components of climate change include greenhouse gases, which are driving climate change, concentrations of CO2, methane, nitrous oxides. Temperatures are changing, both air, sea surface, freshwater temperatures. Precipitation and ice patterns are changing. Rain is increasing. Snowfall and ice cover, or snow cover and ice cover, are decreasing. Ocean dynamics, sea levels are shifting due to water changes in water currents and also the melting of ice. Ocean acidification is going on, so we're becoming increasingly more acidic in the oceans due to increases in CO2 and increasing or decreasing carbonates, which are used for calcification of corals and other organisms. And extreme events such as floods, droughts, storms, and fires, we're all already experiencing those things and seeing them on an annual basis. So these changes all have the potential to alter almost every aspect of biodiversity at levels ranging from genes to species to communities to whole landscapes. And so on the other figure here, I'm showing levels of biological response from communities, species, and genes. At the gene level, the process of evolution is changing through mutation, natural selection, and speciation. Organismal physiology, fecundity, survival, circadian rhythms, disease susceptibility, all being altered. Population dynamics in terms of recruitment, age structure, sex ratios, and abundance, all shifting. Species distributions, their ecological niches and range sizes are changing. Interspecific interactions of competition, predation, parasitism, mutualism changing. And ecosystem services such as biomass production, water availability, pest control, and tourism, all changing. So, although there are few documented extinctions caused by climate change at this point in time, there is reason to believe its impacts are just beginning and that climate may become a dominant contributor to biodiversity loss in the near future. So let's talk a little bit about the theoretic potential responses to climate change. So species can change their phenotypes, altering their morphology, physiology, or behavior to become better suited to the new local conditions. Species can change their phenology, altering the timing of life cycle events like reproduction or migration in order to adjust important biological activities to be better suited to the environment. And species can shift their spatial distributions by moving to more appropriate environmental conditions. Now, these responses can arise through phenotypic plasticity, those individuals whose genotypes have the ability to express different phenotypes under different environmental conditions, or through genetic adaptation, where intraspecific variation within the population's gene pool allows natural selection to weed out less fit phenotypes. And we'll talk about these in a few slides down here. So I begin by noting that documented global extinctions caused by climate change are surprisingly rare. As I said a slide or two ago. The first and only known global extinction that was caused just by global climate change was documented in 2019. And it's this rat over here called the Bramble K. Malomes. This is an island, Bramble K Island, off of the southeast corner of Papua New Guinea. It's a very small island. It's only like 3.6 hectares in size. And with the change in ocean storms, sea level rises, and high tides, the island has gone underwater several times. And with it was the loss of the Bramble K. Malomes, which only occurs on this single island. So to call it a global extinction, it is the extinction of it from the planet, but it's from a single location. So it's technically a local extinction, but it caused the global loss of this species. The rat actually feeds on turtle eggs and grasses on the island when it existed. And it was basically scoured of vegetation by the floods, and of course drowned many of the rats themselves, if any of them at all were to survive. So anyway, it's our first known global extinction caused solely by global climate change. The first species listed on the U.S. endangered species list was the polar bear. It was listed in 2008 as threatened. It should have been listed as endangered. Those are two different status categories in the U.S. endangered species list. Threatened are ones that are likely going to become endangered in the near future, whereas endangered are in danger of actual extinction. And this is due to the loss of sea ice that threatens the polar bear and will likely continue to threaten polar bear habitat as we continually lose ice. And probably by the beginning of the next century, it's predicted, if things don't change, that all the sea ice will be lost. Let's talk about the very first sort of response, and this is probably the strongest signal of biotic change, is our geographic range shifts, which allow organisms to track changing environmental conditions. Generally, they're poleward or upward in elevation, and a review of 99 species of birds, butterflies, and alpine herbs showed that they move towards the poles at a rate of about 6.1 kilometers per decade. This is probably one of our oldest documented case histories of a geographic range shift. This was a study conducted back in about 1996 on the western coast of the US. And what you're looking at here on the left, the species is Edith's checker spot butterfly, which is listed on the US endangered species list as endangered. And here in the left figure, you're looking at extinct and extant populations of Edith's checker spot butterfly. They range from northern Mexico all the way to Canada. Much of the populations, many of the populations from Oregon and Washington on into Canada are fairly recent movements of Edith's checker spot butterfly. The ones in red are extinct populations. The one in blue are extant. And in this paper, they graph the populations that are extinct latitudinally going from south to north, and the population's extinct in terms of percent on an elevational band in terms of meters. And what we can see is that populations have a higher probability of being extant, having a lower extinction probability if they're 2,400 meters or greater, shown here on the lower. In terms of the latitudinal survivorship, if we compared populations down in Mexico to those up in Canada, we would see about a fourfold decrease in the number of populations going extinct. So it's this northern movement into better climates that's allowing Edith's checker spot butterfly to avoid the impacts of climate change through geographic range shifts. Now, that was a single species. Let me show you a study with a multitude of species. This was done in Britain. This is of 329 species in Britain, including millipedes, spiders, butterflies, beetles, dragonflies, fish, reptiles, amphibians, birds, and mammals. 84%, or 275 of those species, showed clear northward range shifts between 1960 and 2000. And so what you're looking at here on the x-axis are the names of the organisms that are being looked at. Herptiles, that's reptiles and amphibians, harvestmen, a type of spider, mammals, birds, grasshoppers, butterflies, longhorn beetles, lacewings, fish, carabids, aquatic bugs, millipedes, woodlice, spiders, soldier beetles, and dragonflies, are the majority of which are showing significant increases or expansions northward in their ranges. And this is in kilometers that we're looking at here. Only herptiles and harvestmen went the opposite direction. The ones with asterisks above are significant differences. And the blue, yellow, and red bars are basically different levels of sampling. You could say the intensity of sampling, the size of the range itself is smaller in blue, intermediate in yellow, larger in red, with more species being included. And so they were sort of asking the question about the sensitivity of the analyses in terms of the sampling itself. And what you can see is that in many cases, not in all, they're showing basically the same response. For example, longhorn beetles here are showing pretty much the same response. Birds are showing the same response. However, none of it is significant. There's too much variation in the data. In others, more sampling probably fine-tunes the sampling, showing a much lower expansion of the range. Anyway, I wish they had just put one bar in it. It makes it a lot easier to explain. But they're all moving northward is the point of the data. And lots of different organisms are also moving in the predicted direction, following cooler climates, if you will. There's documentation in hundreds of plant and animal species locally. So this is only one selected study among many. The literature's has, as I say, hundreds to even thousands of studies out there. There's also well-documented examples of climate-induced range shifts in marine environments as well. First, I'll show you the data over here on the right. This is all one study. This is with the American lobster, red hake, shown here in the middle, and black sea bass down here. These are, of course, all commercial from commercial fisheries. And we're tracking the movements along the western coast of the United States from 1968 to 2015. And you can see the average distance moved in miles here in figure B of the American lobster, the red hake, and the black sea bass. And you can also see that pattern here. Black sea bass in the light green are more southern. And as time passes to 2015 are the darker dots shown, which have gone more northward. And the same holds true for the American lobster, going from yellow to dark orange, and red hake going from light blue up to dark blue. So you can see the northward migration of all three of these, and they're moving well over 150 miles northward. There was also a review of 1,735 biological responses of marine organisms to climate change, and they found that more than 80% were in a northward direction, averaging about 72 kilometers per decade. So down here are benthic algae, cnidarians, mollusks, crustaceans, benthic invertebrates, phytoplankton, zooplankton, larval bony fish, non-bony fish, bony fish, seabirds, and then an average of all the taxa. In the upper diagram shows the distributional change in kilometers, going from warmer to cooler temperatures, moving from south to north, basically. And the black dots are the average response. The red dots are actually the moving edge going northward, and the little brown dots are the trailing edge from where they came. And so you can basically, the punch is the black dots are all northward, except for non-bony fish shown here. Non-bony fish. Also, there was a phenological change. So the movement patterns are into cooler temperatures are shifting their reproductive state to earlier times, okay? There are also altered phenologies. That is the timing of life cycle events like reproduction and migration. And this is probably the oldest documented example of phenological shifts. And this is on flowering of cherry trees in Kyoto, Japan. This is the longest running time series of plant flowering, 1,200 years of data on at the Cherry Blossom Festival, which is held annually. So by the 1980s and early 1990s, the average flowering times were earlier than any time previously over the 1,200 years, about 7 days earlier, corresponding to increased regional temperatures. So here we are all the way back in the year 850. And you can see that there's a lot of slop in the data. It's bouncing all over the place. A large variation, as much as 20 days in variation. And you can see that's averaged out at a historical level. And then the earlier blossom dates since the 1980s to 2000 has shifted by as much as 7 days earlier, with nothing historically that early. So something's going on, certainly, and we suspect it's global climate change. There's a lot of additional studies that have shown that plants around the world have altered the timing of their flowering as a result of climate change. A review of first flowering date for 405 plant species in the United Kingdom from 1753 to 2008 occurred. And this is the figure over here that I'm showing. What the authors did was they converted flowering dates to a single community level index that displays how the average timing of reproduction has changed in plants in the UK. The little black bars are 25-year averages in each case, all the way through time. And flowering dates in the most recent 25 years, shown over here on the far right, have been 2.2 to 12.5 days earlier than any other 25-year period since 1760, with flowering occurring 5 days earlier for every 1 degree C increase in temperature. Okay. Now, altered phenologies are not necessarily a threat to biodiversity, but that can lead to population asynchronies. So let me give you an example over here on the left. This is a Rocky Mountain Biological Lab in Gothic, Colorado. This is in the southwest corner of Colorado. And the flowering phenologies of the montane meadow plants have all shifted to earlier flowering. Unfortunately, for both the plant and the bumblebee, and there's a large number of bumblebee species that pollinate these plants, and they're a primary pollinator at these high montane sites, high elevation montane sites. The bumblebees have not shifted their phenologies, and therefore the bumblebee populations themselves have been dwindling, and the reproductive success of the plants have also gone down. Another example is shown here. This is a great tit feeding her young, and this is her day of laying through time, going from 1972 to 1996. And you can see, although there's a lot of slop in the data, statistically, there's no differences in laying date. They feed on caterpillars, and they take their caterpillars, although this one has a moth, go figure. They typically, though, feed their young caterpillars. And what's happened is the population of caterpillars has declined in terms of their peak date and abundance. And so they're becoming asynchronous with the date of laying for the great tit. And so this could lead to a decline in reproductive success for the great tit. And the caterpillar will probably continue on shifting its phenology as temperatures continue to change. There's also the prospects for the failure of an organism to adjust or to adapt. And this was a really neat study published in Science by Barry Sinervo and a large cadre of people globally in 2010. And they compared recent 2006 to 2008 to historical surveys conducted in 1975 to 1995 for 48 Scoloporus lizard species. These are spiny lizard species. There's a couple of them shown here at the bottom. This study was conducted at 200 sites throughout Mexico. Since 1975, 12% of sites were locally extinct by 2009 due to temperatures exceeding their thermal maxima, what we call Tmax, leading to death. So lizards are heliotropes. They tend to come outside, they sunbathe, and they absorb heat. Well, they can only absorb so much heat before it can become lethal. And rising temperatures can cause them to overheat and hit that thermal maximum, which can lead to death. Of course, lizards can retreat to cool refuges rather than risk death by overheating, but that limits foraging, constraining growth, maintenance, and reproduction, and it undermines population growth rates and raises extinction risk. So if temperatures get too close to that thermal maxima through global climate change through time, lizards could only come outside for a matter of minutes before they're going to have to run back into their cool retreat to avoid death, basically, by approaching that thermal maxima of overheating. So if climate change Tmax continues unabated in Mexico, 56% of viviparous sites will be extinct by 2050 and 66 by 2080. For oviparous sites, 46% will be extinct by 2050 and 61% by 2080. Now, lizards that are viviparous are ones that have live birth. So it can be a greater heat stress on raising young if you're viviparous than if you're oviviparous. Oviparous, sorry. Oviparous are egg-laying lizards. So there is a distinction. Now I show a set of models here on the extinction probability through time for oviparous and viviparous lizards. Extinction is in blue is less than 0.1. The probability is greater than 0.9 or 10%, 90% if it's in red. So you can see that through time with an increase in temperature, this is if global climate change is unabated, greenhouse gases are unabated, we would see these patterns of increasing extinctions of these populations through time. So the ones that are documented are up here in 1975 to 2009. And what you're seeing are the low elevation populations in yellow here on the left. And for viviparous, you can see that there are more of them that are impacted in low elevation sites low latitude sites and low elevation sites both. Okay, so you want to move either up a mountain or further northward to maintain cooler temperatures. Overall, lizards can't evolve rapidly enough to track current climate change because of constraints arising from the genetic architecture of thermal preference. So a shift in body temperature by 1 degree centigrade yields only a 0.5 degrees centigrade correlated response in Tmax. Thus, Tmax may not evolve fast enough to keep up with evolved change in body temperature. So because it's lagging by a half. Okay. Now, I showed you this example with the great tit, and this is the same data set. Date of laying is constant through time. The caterpillar peak date, they're becoming earlier, more abundant earlier, and getting out of sync with the laying date to feed the offspring of the great tits. But down here, I've added another figure which says the selection differential through time from 72 to 96. And what you're seeing is selection for earlier laying birds, which would tend to put them back into sync with the caterpillar peak date. Now, what is a selection differential, you might ask? A selection differential is the relationship between reproductive success or fitness. So this could be number of offspring surviving, for example, and a trait of the organism. And in this case, it's going to be the time, the trait's going to be the time of laying. So earlier egg laying through time. So with a positive relationship, if we reversed our didn't go from low to high, but went from high to low here on our trait, fitness should increase. And the selection differential is a calculation of the slope of this line. Now, normally there'll be a lot of variation of points around it. I drew it for simplicity, but the slope of this line will tell you the strength of the relationship between fitness and the trait. But if there's no heritability for this trait, that is, that there's a relationship, a heritable component to that trait from the parents to the offspring, then it doesn't matter if there's a negative selection differential. There has to be a heritable component so that it's perpetuated from generation to generation. Otherwise, there's no evolutionary change, because your response to selection is a calculation of the heritability, which is estimated as the mid-parent trait, in this case, the timing of offspring production, and the offspring's trait, that is, when their fitness is higher, which would be by laying eggs earlier. You end up collectively increasing your reproductive success that way. So if you have no heritability, I put here 0, you have no response to selection. There'll be no change, as I show here with the other two examples. Okay, so this is the selection differential. Sorry, 0.62 was held the same, but I varied the heritability for that particular trait. So I hope my rambling was clear. So fitness losses, reductions in survival or reproductive rates can be mitigated if populations respond adaptively by undergoing morphological, physiological, or behavioral changes that maintain an adequate match between phenotype and environment. So in this case, it is a physiological shift, but in a way, it's also a behavioral. It's something we see changing in the organism. There's another way that organisms can respond, though. They don't have to necessarily adapt in that sort of setting. Evolutionary changes typically take a considerable amount of time, and there's usually a time lag, as there is with the greater tits. There's a time lag between adaptation and success for the birds. There's another way, though, is through something known as phenotypic plasticity, where you have a phenotype that shifts environments. Say from the south, it goes north, and you end up increasing its reproductive success because it has shifted its response to reproducing earlier, instead of the case of the lagging greater tits that aren't responding to that shift in the timing of peak food supply. Now, phenotypic plasticity is often in the literature thought about as having a non-genetic basis. Well, of course it has a genetic basis, but it's a plastic genetic basis, so it has to have the environmental cue to get it to change its behavior or its physiology in this case. And one way you could test that is do what we call common garden experiments, where you would put the birds in their normal environment, maybe in outdoor cages, and have them breed, have them lay eggs. I don't know how feasible that truly is, but people do those sorts of experiments, and then do it in the new environment as well to see if the birds shift or don't shift in terms of their phenotypes. So these are pretty tricky things, though, to do to assess phenotypic plasticity, but it does have a genetic basis as well. Now, I say, quote, adaptive change, phenological versus morphological traits. So what we just showed you was phenological shifts, that is the timing of the breeding. There was what we call a meta-analysis, where we take a whole lot of studies, collapse them into one big study to get a strong signal of response. And in this case, they were focusing primarily on birds because we have the best data for birds. And the result of this meta-analysis suggested that global warming has not systematically affected morphological traits. In other words, they're not changing, but has advanced phenological traits. So egg-laying date, or recruitment, or reproduction, or arrival date, migration patterns are earlier, are all shifting significantly to earlier. And you can see in this figure, the phenological traits, for the most part, have shifted to earlier timing of events. But for morphological traits, which are below, like things like body mass and reproduction and recruitment and body mass and survival, there's no significant difference in any of those traits. In fact, if anything, they're moving, a few are moving positively, much more so than the phenological shifts. And so you can see down here across studies, phenologically, they're shifting on average to earlier. Morphologically, there's no significant change, and recruitment, reproduction, and survival all occurring successfully and significantly earlier. Now, I say it's adaptive for some species. It's not adaptive for all species, and perhaps that's because there's often a time delay between movement and adaptation, or even phenotypic plastic responses. So it doesn't guarantee their persistence. They can still go down the tube, so to speak, hopefully not as quickly after movement. Now, the last type of trait that changes is body size, decreasing body size. And is it a universal response to increasing temperatures? Now, decreasing body size has been proposed as a universal response to increasing temperatures. The physiology behind the response is well established for ectotherms, those that warm from the environment, inhabiting aquatic environments. As higher temperatures decrease the aerobic capacity, as higher temperatures decrease the aerobic capacity, individuals with smaller body size have a reduced risk of oxygen deprivation. Okay, so our oceans are warming. And here's a study on North Sea fishes. The North Sea, if you don't recall, sits between the United Kingdom and Norway, and north of the Netherlands and Germany. And over a 40-year period, 6 of 8 commercial fish species in the North Sea underwent reductions in body size with a 1 to 2 degrees centigrade increase in water temperature. And I'm just showing you a few of these. Most of them are are showing downward trends. Some are not significant because they averaged about midway between 1970 and 2000. They took data here and then they took data there and they compared. These are cod from the north and south portions of the North Sea. These are not statistically different, albeit they are heading in the right trajectory today. So I don't count those as quote adaptive in this case to that sort of a shift. Haddock and whiting, which are shown here, are clearly declining in terms of body size. Down here I have herring, panel F, again declining. Sole, significant declines, and plaice, a significant decline as well here. But you can see negative trends, except for panel G, which is herring stock from the southern portion of the North Sea, where this herring stock is from the northern portion of the sea. Why it's doing something different, it might be temperature related, it might not be, because other fish species from the southern portion are responding in a more negative fashion, as you can see. What's the ramifications of that? Well, smaller body sizes, although it's good for the fish, it's not good for the trophic chain of those that feed on those fish, because smaller body sizes are because body size is decreasing for those fish species. It's also not good for the commercial fisheries. These are all commercial fishes. The smaller body size decreases the yield per recruit of these stocks by an average of 23%. And as temperatures climb, if they are in fact responding to temperature in terms of decreasing body size, which they appear to be doing, the yield should even go down further. Okay, let's talk a little bit about, am I running out of time here? Am I okay time-wise? I've got a few more slides, so I'll continue on here. So a recent paper in 2018 has shown that if climate change continues unabated, nearly every ecosystem on the planet would change dramatically to the point of becoming an entirely new biome. This paper tries to find clues about the world of the future by examining the ecology of the past. Between the peak of the last ice age about 20,000 years ago and 1800 AD, the world warmed between 4 to 7 degrees Celsius. And this is showing, based on 42 paleontologists who compiled the data for this. Each little square is a study site assessing sediment cores so that they can reconstruct ancient biomes, basically plant biomes. And what they're showing here is in orange, there's large changes from 20,000 years ago to 1800 AD in those biomes. The yellows and the beige are moderate to low changes. So what you can see is more northerly, we're getting quite an impact in the composition of the plants that are growing there and their structure, that is, whether they're tall or short or heavy or not. So these estimates, what they're doing here is that these estimates are roughly comparable to the magnitude of warming that Earth is projected to undergo in the next 100 to 150 years if global greenhouse gas emissions on a global basis are not substantially reduced. And so what did those shifts, ecosystem shifts, look like? So consider for a second the scale of these changes. If you took a walk through Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C. today, you'd see almost entirely deciduous hardwood forest, oak trees and beech and tulip poplar. But if you were to walk through Rock Creek Valley 20,000 years ago, you would be walking through boreal forest. It's the same story out west. In the Sonoran Desert in Saguaro National Park, there's big saguaro cacti, mesquite trees, ironwood trees. If we were to roll back the calendar 20,000 years and we went to the same place, we would find a woodland of evergreen trees. So this shows you the extent of en masse ecosystem changes. And their studies give two scenarios of about a 1.5 degrees C versus a 4 to 5 degrees C change in projected temperature. This is most likely the 4 to 5 degrees C if we do nothing about greenhouse gases. And the probabilities are much greater. They're shown here in dark purple on panels D and F for composition and structure. That we're going to have an en masse change in the ecosystems within 100 to 150 years. All right. So they conclude from these looks that terrestrial vegetation over the entire planet is at substantial risk of major compositional and structural changes in the absence of reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Much of the change would occur during the 21st century. This next 80 years. Many ecosystems will be novel in composition, structure, and function. Many will be ephemeral under sustained climate change. In other words, they're apt to wink out. And equilibrium states may not be attained until the 22nd century or even beyond that. So there's a lot of changes that we're seeing currently in landscapes. This is Pinus edulis. Pinus edulis in Arizona, south of the Mogollon Rim, south of Flagstaff, south of Sedona, Arizona. All of these brown little blots in there are Pinus edulis. And here, that was in October 2002, May 2004, they're all dead. It's predominantly now a cedar forest. In Montseny Mountains in Spain, in 1945, it was all heath and grassland. In 2001, we're seeing the invasion of beech trees to high elevation with climate change. Same thing with Gamble oak shrublands in New Mexico. This was a ponderosa pine forest. Now it's turned into a Gamble oak shrub field, basically, from the changing temperatures and the drought conditions. Kelp forests in the west coast of Australia are being taken over by seaweed turf. And basically we're shifting from a subtropical system along the west coast of Australia to one that's more tropical-like. The fish and all the organisms are tropical now with the seaweed turf. So let's talk a moment about native species or invasive species. Does the distinction blur as the world warms? So what are the differences and consequent similarities between invasive and native species in light of climate change? Unlike the introduction of non-native species, which tends to be idiosyncratic and usually depends on human-mediated transport, climate-driven redistribution is ubiquitous. It follows repeated patterns and is poised to influence a greater proportion of Earth's biota. Species moving on their own will likely be distinguishable from alien species introduced through global trade and travel. Some experts question whether climate-displaced species should be characterized as unwanted intruders at all. Of 935 extinctions since 1500, 261 of 782 animal species, or 33%, and 39 of 153 plant species, or 25%, had invasive aliens as one of the extinction drivers. aliens were sole drivers for 126 extinct species, or 42% of 300 species. In contrast, only 2.7% of animal extinctions, 21 species, and 4.6% of plant extinctions, 7 species, had native species listed as one of the extinction drivers. Native species were the sole drivers for none of the extinct plant and animal species. So invasive aliens accounted for 12 times as many extinctions of animal species as native taxa, and 5.6 times as many extinctions of plant species. So there is a difference between, at least currently, between native and invasive alien species. So what can we conclude? It seems that the biogeographic origin of a species is relevant to its ecological impact, contrary to assertions that the distinction between native and alien species has no theoretical or practical importance to conservation. Ongoing anthropogenic disturbance, such as climate change, can release native species from biotic constraints, perhaps causing them to dominate their communities to the detriment of biodiversity. This is a concern and may occur as time passes, especially when we really start to scramble some of the ecosystems. But native species undergoing outbreaks, even those expanding their range into adjacent territory, are less likely than alien species to encounter resident natives that lack evolutionary experience with them. A lot of the movement are going in tandem, where species that are familiar with one another are making that move. So what can we do? I've got just a couple of more slides and a few more comments I'll make. Managing the effects of climate change on biodiversity. One thing is we can identify refugia that serve as safe havens for biodiversity during anthropogenic climate change. The snow leopards, a grand example of that. There has been what we call climate envelope models conducted, showing basically the habitat that was lost in the last glacial maximum in purple, habitat that'll be lost by 1950, by 2070, based on rising temperatures and shifts, and then habitat that's remaining by 2070, which is further north. So they're trying to fit the climate needs of the snow leopard. And there's a hatched area over most of this orange that will serve as refugial populations. So they want to maintain this for the future. Also optimizing migration pathways for finding suitable habitat. For example, this is the Yukon to Yellowstone corridor that's been constructed. This was, lost my dates on here, was constructed back in about 1996 and has been added to since. This is, I think, 2012 snapshot. And this is a corridor for the movement of large mammals like bison and grizzly bears, cougars, and gray wolves. So these can serve as suitable habitats as global climate changes. Also, there's something known as assisted migration, where we transplant isolated populations of rare and endangered species northward when they're under stress, under threat. This is I always forget this, the western swamp turtle from Australia, where it currently is located. Their habitat's drying up, so they've moved them 250 kilometers north and put them into more stable swamplands. And building evolutionary resilience. We want to increase population sizes, maintain adaptive potential in target genes and traits, identify and protect evolutionary hotspots and refugia. So this is the small population paradigm. We want to have as many and as large a populations as we can, with a lot of rich biodiversity and differences across the systems. My last slide, using biodiversity for climate mitigation. That's through reforestation or afforestation, planting trees on lands not previously forested. Here is the Amazon basin in 2001, a snapshot of a piece of the Amazon basin. And in 2019, it's been reforested, or afforested, if you will. And ecosystem restoration to increase carbon sequestration from the atmosphere by plants. Here's a mangrove in Senegal on the western coast of Africa. They've been 50% of mangrove forest have been removed along the coastlines, mainly to farm seafoods like shrimp. And of course, it's reducing the native species. These are nurseries for lots of fish species that are commercially harvested ultimately. But anyway, the idea here is to put them back for all kinds of biodiversity benefits, but in this case, climate mitigation. All right, I'm done.
Thank you, Ken.
Wonderful, Ken. Thank you so much.